Argentina is known worldwide for its European influence, from its architecture to its language and traditions. But beneath the surface lies a surprising truth. Most Argentinians carry indigenous DNA without even realizing it. The common belief is that Argentina is a nation built by European immigrants. Yet genetic studies tell a completely different story. Over half of the population has Native American ancestry. But why is this part of history so overlooked? What makes Argentine DNA so unique compared to the rest of Latin America? To understand this mystery, we have to go back thousands of years. Before the arrival of the Spanish, Argentina was home to numerous indigenous civilizations. The Mapuche, Guarani, Diaguita, and many others thrived across the land for centuries. These were not small, scattered tribes. They had well-developed societies, complex languages, and a deep connection to the land. Archaeological evidence shows human presence in Argentina dating back at least 13,000 years. But despite their deep roots, these populations were largely erased from the country's historical narrative. When the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, they brought with them a new genetic influence. But the way this genetic mixing happened was not balanced. Spanish men became the dominant ruling class, while indigenous and African women were often forced into relationships or servitude. This created a unique genetic pattern that we still see today. Most Argentinians inherit their European ancestry from their fathers, while their maternal lineage remains largely indigenous. This is why mitochondrial DNA studies consistently show high percentages of Native American ancestry, even in people who consider themselves of purely European descent. But there's another layer to this story, one that few people talk about. Argentina also has a significant African genetic influence. During the colonial period, tens of thousands of African slaves were brought to the region, especially through Buenos Aires and Córdoba. They worked in plantations, domestic service, and even fought in Argentina's wars of independence. However, after slavery was abolished, the African presence in Argentina was systematically erased. Official records stopped categorizing people by race, and the idea of a white European Argentina was promoted. Despite this, DNA evidence proves that African ancestry is still present in many regions, particularly in Córdoba and Santiago del Estero. Then came the great European migration wave of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Millions of Italians, Spaniards, Germans, and other Europeans arrived, drastically reshaping Argentina's population. Cities like Buenos Aires, Rosario, and Mendoza became melting pots of cultures. Italian and Spanish influences became dominant, shaping everything from the Argentine accent to its cuisine. But while this immigration brought significant European genes, it didn't completely replace the indigenous genetic base. In many rural areas, especially in the north, indigenous communities remained strong, preserving their genetic identity despite the changing times. What makes Argentina's genetic makeup even more unique is that this mixing didn't happen evenly. In regions like Patagonia and Buenos Aires, European ancestry is dominant. But in northern provinces like Jujuy, Salta, and Misiones, indigenous DNA remains far more common. The contrast is striking. Some people in Buenos Aires might have nearly 90% European ancestry, while others in the north could be overwhelmingly Native American. This regional variation is one of the reasons why Argentina's DNA is so diverse and complex. Today, modern genetic testing is challenging the long-held belief that Argentina is a purely European nation. Many people are discovering hidden indigenous and African roots in their ancestry. For decades, the government promoted a European identity, but science is proving that Argentina's true heritage is far more diverse. The country's DNA is a mosaic of ancient civilizations, colonial conquests, forced migrations, and voluntary settlements. Argentina's DNA tells a fascinating story of survival, adaptation, and hidden ancestry. But what exactly shaped this unique genetic blueprint? Unlike most of Latin America, where indigenous and European mixing followed a somewhat predictable pattern, Argentina's history took a different turn, one that left behind a genetic signature unlike any other. One of the biggest reasons for this uniqueness is the scale of European immigration. Between 1880 and 1930, Argentina received over 6 million immigrants, mostly from Italy and Spain. This was one of the largest migration waves in modern history, completely transforming the country's population. But this wasn't just a case of Europeans arriving and taking over. Instead, they mixed with existing populations in a complex way, creating a genetic landscape that was neither fully European nor entirely indigenous. However, something unusual happened with male and female genetic inheritance. Y chromosome studies show that Argentina's paternal lineage is overwhelmingly European. Almost 92% of men trace their ancestry back to Europe. But on the maternal side, the story is completely different. Mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mothers, reveals that nearly 76% of Argentinians have Native American ancestry through their maternal lines. This genetic pattern is the result of colonial history, where European men often formed relationships with indigenous and African women. Over generations, this created a population that identifies as European but carries a deeply rooted indigenous genetic legacy. Another key factor in Argentina's genetic uniqueness is the country's geography. Argentina is massive, the eighth largest country in the world, and its vast landscape played a crucial role in shaping genetic diversity. The northern provinces, rich in indigenous history, remained relatively isolated, allowing Native American genes to persist. Meanwhile, the fertile Pampas plains became the center of European settlement, leading to a stronger European genetic presence in cities like Buenos Aires and Rosario. In the south, Patagonia was sparsely populated, and while it became home to European immigrants, it also retained some of the region's indigenous Mapuche ancestry. But there's more to this story than just a mix of indigenous and European genes. Argentina's African ancestry, though often overlooked, also left a lasting impact. DNA studies reveal that while only about 1% of the population identifies as Afro-Argentine, genetic markers show that African ancestry is present in many people, especially in regions like Córdoba and Santiago del Estero. This hidden African heritage is a reminder of the tens of thousands of enslaved Africans brought to Argentina during the colonial period, whose contributions to the country's culture and genetics were later erased from historical narratives. Additionally, Argentina's unique genetic makeup was shaped by political and social policies. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the government actively promoted a European identity, encouraging mass immigration while downplaying indigenous and African heritage. This led to a national identity centered around European ancestry, even though genetic studies now prove that Argentina's population is far more diverse than previously thought. Modern DNA research is now uncovering the full picture, revealing Argentina as a country where genetic diversity runs far deeper than most people realize. The combination of massive European immigration, indigenous survival, forced African migration, and regional isolation created a DNA profile unlike any other in the world. Argentina's DNA is not just a mix of different ancestries. It's a living record of forgotten histories, hidden migrations, and unexpected genetic twists. But what makes it stand out from the rest of Latin America? The answer lies in the unexpected survival of indigenous genetic markers, the subtle presence of African ancestry, and a European influence that is far more complex than it seems. Unlike many neighboring countries, where European colonization followed a clear pattern, Argentina experienced something different. Spanish rule introduced a wave of settlers, but they didn't arrive in overwhelming numbers like in Mexico or Peru. Instead, they mixed with local populations, often through forced relationships, leading to a unique genetic blend. The indigenous communities of Argentina, particularly in the north and west, left a stronger than expected genetic mark, despite centuries of efforts to erase them culturally. But then came a dramatic shift. In the late 19th century, Argentina welcomed millions of European immigrants, mostly Italians and Spaniards, who reshaped the genetic landscape. However, unlike in North America, where men and women migrated in relatively equal numbers, Argentina saw a huge imbalance. Most immigrants were men. This created a very specific genetic pattern: European paternal ancestry dominating the Y chromosome, while maternal DNA showed deep indigenous roots. Another overlooked aspect of Argentina's genetic puzzle is its African heritage. Buenos Aires was one of the key ports in the transatlantic slave trade, and thousands of Africans were brought to Argentina during the colonial period. By the early 19th century, Afro-Argentines made up a significant portion of the population. Yet today, their presence is almost invisible. While historical records suggest they disappeared due to war, disease, and assimilation, DNA tells a different story. Genetic studies reveal that African ancestry still lingers in many Argentine families, often unnoticed and unspoken. Geography also played a role in shaping Argentina's DNA. The isolated mountain regions of the Northwest became refuges for indigenous communities, allowing their genetic markers to survive. Meanwhile, the fertile Pampas plains became the heart of European settlement, leading to a stronger European genetic influence in those areas. Patagonia, with its extreme climate and sparse population, remained a stronghold for indigenous groups like the Mapuche, who resisted European dominance for centuries. But Argentina's genetic makeup is not just a product of history. It's also been shaped by politics. Throughout the 20th century, the country emphasized its European identity, downplaying its indigenous and African roots. This led many Argentines to believe they were almost entirely of European descent, even when their DNA told a different story. Today, modern genetic studies are challenging these old narratives, revealing a far more diverse ancestry than most people expected. Argentina's genetic makeup is full of contradictions, traces of lost civilizations, echoes of forced migrations, and hidden ancestry that even its own people have overlooked. One of the most striking discoveries in recent genetic studies is how indigenous DNA, thought to have been erased, still exists in unexpected ways. But there's a mystery. Why does Argentina have such a strong indigenous maternal lineage, while its paternal ancestry is overwhelmingly European? The answer lies in centuries of complex social dynamics. During Spanish colonization, European men vastly outnumbered European women. This created a pattern where European men fathered children with indigenous and African women, passing on European Y chromosomes, but preserving native mitochondrial DNA. Over generations, this left a deep genetic imprint, one where indigenous ancestry is primarily found on the maternal side, while European ancestry dominates male lineage. This phenomenon isn't unique to Argentina, but the scale at which it happened here is remarkable. But what about Argentina's whitening policies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries? During this period, the government actively encouraged European immigration, while simultaneously downplaying its indigenous and African roots. Schools, census records, and even national identity campaigns reinforced the idea that Argentina was a country of European descent. Yet, DNA evidence tells a different story. Despite efforts to erase indigenous presence from national consciousness, genetic studies have found that nearly 60% of Argentines carry some degree of indigenous ancestry. However, not all indigenous groups contributed equally to this genetic legacy. The Mapuche, Diaguita, and Com left some of the strongest markers, while other smaller groups saw their genetic influence diminish over time. In the Northwest, where Spanish control was weaker, native communities preserved their bloodlines more intact. But in the Pampas and urban centers, where European settlement was heavier, indigenous influence became more diluted. The African component of Argentina's DNA follows a similar pattern. While often ignored in historical narratives, the genetic evidence of African ancestry is still present, particularly in certain regions like Córdoba and Buenos Aires. This suggests that while Afro-Argentines were culturally assimilated, their genetic footprint never truly disappeared. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Argentina's DNA is its constant evolution. Modern migration patterns are adding new layers to an already complex genetic mix. In recent decades, new waves of immigrants from Asia and neighboring Latin American countries have introduced fresh genetic diversity, reshaping the country's ancestral makeup once again. Argentina's genetic story is not just about where its people come from. It's about the hidden history buried within their DNA. While most Argentines identify with their European roots, their genetic code tells a far more intricate tale. One of the most unexpected revelations is how deeply connected the nation is to the indigenous past, even when cultural memory suggests otherwise. Mitochondrial DNA studies have shown that Native American maternal ancestry is far more widespread than previously assumed. This means that, despite centuries of colonization and assimilation, the genetic legacy of indigenous women has remained intact. Unlike written history, which can be rewritten or erased, DNA preserves the truth of Argentina's origins. But while the maternal lineage reveals strong indigenous roots, the paternal ancestry follows a drastically different path. Y chromosome analysis consistently finds that the vast majority of Argentine males descend from European men. This is the genetic imprint of colonization, where European settlers and later immigrants left a dominant mark on male lineage, while native bloodlines continued through generations of indigenous mothers. Yet, the genetic map of Argentina is not uniform. Some regions, like the Andean Northwest, have retained a much stronger indigenous presence in both maternal and paternal lines. In contrast, urban centers such as Buenos Aires, heavily influenced by European immigration, show a significantly lower percentage of Native American ancestry. Meanwhile, areas like Córdoba reveal a more complex mix, with traces of African heritage that often go unrecognized in mainstream narratives. Despite these differences, there is one undeniable truth. Argentina's DNA does not align with the national identity it has long promoted. The concept of a homogeneous European-descended population is a myth, one that genetic research continues to dismantle. As more Argentines take DNA tests, many are confronted with an unexpected reality. Their ancestry is far more diverse than they ever imagined. Argentina's genetic makeup is a direct reflection of its complex and often turbulent history. While official narratives have long emphasized European ancestry, the reality is far more nuanced. Beneath the surface, the nation's DNA carries the traces of forgotten migrations, forced displacements, and cultural blending that shaped its people over centuries. One of the most striking genetic patterns in Argentina is the clear divide between urban and rural populations. Large cities like Buenos Aires, Rosario, and Córdoba became hubs for European immigrants, who arrived in massive waves between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This influx altered the genetic landscape of urban areas, making them appear overwhelmingly European. However, in rural and mountainous regions, a different story unfolds. Indigenous and mixed heritage communities persisted, maintaining higher levels of Native American ancestry. The genetic legacy of African slaves in Argentina is another overlooked chapter. Although the country once had a significant Afro-Argentine population, decades of intermarriage, cultural assimilation, and historical erasure contributed to the misconception that African heritage had nearly disappeared. In reality, genetic studies reveal that African maternal lineages are still present, particularly in provinces like Santiago del Estero and parts of Córdoba. These findings challenge long-standing beliefs about the racial and ethnic composition of the nation. Another unique aspect of Argentine DNA is the unexpected presence of Middle Eastern and Jewish ancestry. While often attributed to 20th century migration, genetic evidence suggests these roots may go even further back, possibly tracing to Sephardic Jewish populations expelled from Spain during the Inquisition. Many immigrants from Syria and Lebanon also arrived in Argentina, blending their heritage with the existing population and leaving a lasting imprint on the nation's gene pool. This intricate web of ancestry proves that Argentina is not a singular, European-descended nation, but rather a genetic mosaic shaped by centuries of movement, adaptation, and survival. With every DNA test taken, more Argentines are discovering unexpected origins, reshaping not only their personal identities, but also the broader understanding of what it truly means to be Argentine. Argentina's genetic identity holds a remarkable contradiction. While its population is often seen as overwhelmingly European, the DNA of its people tells a more intricate story. One of the most revealing aspects of this complexity is the gender-based divide in ancestral origins. Studies show a stark contrast between maternal and paternal lineage. While most Y chromosomes trace back to Europe, a significant majority of mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, belongs to Native American ancestry. This pattern is a direct consequence of historical power dynamics. During the colonial era, Spanish men dominated the region, often taking indigenous women as partners, either through force or coercion, leading to a gradual dilution of Native American male lineages. Over generations, indigenous male populations declined, while European paternal lineage became dominant. However, indigenous maternal heritage remained strong, surviving through generations of intermarriage and cultural assimilation. This phenomenon is not unique to Argentina, but the scale at which it occurred is striking. Even in provinces with strong indigenous cultural presence, such as Salta and Jujuy, the genetic blueprint reflects the systematic replacement of Native American Y chromosomes. At the same time, in more urbanized areas like Buenos Aires, this imbalance became even more pronounced due to massive European immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Another compelling layer to this genetic divide is the presence of African maternal ancestry, which, despite being nearly invisible in mainstream historical narratives, still lingers in the DNA of many Argentines. Enslaved African women, brought during the colonial period, also contributed to the genetic pool, particularly in regions where forced labor was most prevalent. The male African lineage, however, was largely erased, mirroring the fate of indigenous men. Argentina's DNA carries the imprint of its past, one shaped by colonization, migration, and the survival of marginalized groups. These genetic patterns challenge long-standing myths about national identity, revealing that beneath the European facade lies a far richer, more diverse heritage than most Argentines realize. Argentina's genetic landscape has one of the most unexpected twists. Its indigenous ancestry, though often dismissed in mainstream narratives, is deeply embedded in the DNA of millions. But how did this indigenous heritage survive despite centuries of European colonization, forced assimilation, and state-led attempts to whiten the population? The answer lies in an invisible legacy, one that persists not through cultural recognition, but through genetics. Unlike other Latin American countries, where indigenous identity remains visibly strong, Argentina underwent an aggressive campaign of erasure. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, government policies actively sought to Europeanize the nation, portraying indigenous peoples as a vanishing race. Military campaigns, such as the conquest of the desert, decimated native populations, while policies encouraged European immigration to dilute non-European ancestry. Yet, despite these efforts, genetic studies reveal that over half of Argentines still carry indigenous DNA, particularly through their maternal lineage. One reason this genetic survival went unnoticed for so long is that identity in Argentina was historically defined by cultural and linguistic assimilation rather than biological heritage. Many individuals with indigenous ancestry were absorbed into the broader society, adopting European customs and abandoning their native languages. This led to the widespread belief that Argentina had no indigenous presence left, even as genetic evidence proves otherwise. The indigenous genetic imprint is strongest in rural provinces, such as Santiago del Estero and Tucumán, where indigenous maternal haplogroups remain dominant. However, even in urban centers like Buenos Aires, where European ancestry is more prevalent, a surprising number of people carry indigenous genetic markers, often without realizing it. This silent survival of indigenous ancestry is a testament to the resilience of Argentina's first peoples, who, despite centuries of suppression, left an undeniable mark on the nation's genetic identity. In the end, DNA does not lie. While history books may have attempted to erase Argentina's indigenous past, the genes of its people continue to tell a different story, one of endurance, survival, and a heritage far richer than most realize. Argentina's genetic story is full of contradictions, but perhaps the most striking is the near erasure of its African heritage. At one point in history, up to half of Buenos Aires' population was of African descent. Yet today, Argentina is often perceived as one of the whitest countries in Latin America. So what happened? And why do genetic studies reveal traces of African ancestry in many Argentines who don't even realize it? The arrival of African slaves in Argentina began in the 16th century, primarily through the port of Buenos Aires. Enslaved Africans were forced into labor, working on plantations, in households, and even serving in colonial militias. By the late 18th century, the African population had grown significantly, with entire neighborhoods of Buenos Aires being predominantly black. However, Argentina's African presence began to decline dramatically in the 19th century due to a combination of factors: disease outbreaks, forced military conscription, and the country's deliberate push toward European immigration. Unlike Brazil or the Caribbean, where African cultures remained distinct and influential, Argentina's approach was different. Freed Africans and their descendants were encouraged, or forced, to assimilate into the general population. Many intermarried with European immigrants, leading to the gradual dilution of African identity in a cultural sense. But while history attempted to erase their existence, their genetic legacy remained. Recent DNA studies confirm that a notable percentage of Argentines carry sub-Saharan African ancestry, often through their maternal line. This means that while Argentina presents itself as a European nation, its genetic reality is far more complex. African heritage, though culturally suppressed, still exists in the very fabric of the population. Today, efforts are being made to acknowledge and revive Argentina's forgotten African roots. The 2010 census reintroduced the Afro-Argentine category, and historical research continues to uncover the significant role of Africans in shaping the country's identity. Yet, for many Argentines, their African ancestry remains an unknown part of their personal story, hidden in their DNA, waiting to be recognized. For centuries, Argentina has been a country in motion, shaped by waves of migration from every corner of the world. But in the last few decades, a new transformation has taken place, one that is once again altering the genetic landscape of the nation. Unlike the 19th and early 20th centuries, when European immigrants arrived in massive numbers, the modern era has seen an influx from neighboring Latin American countries and even distant regions like China, Korea, and Senegal. Paraguayans, Bolivians, and Peruvians make up the largest immigrant groups today, drawn to Argentina by economic opportunities and cultural ties. Many settle in Buenos Aires and other urban centers, contributing to the growing diversity of the population. Unlike earlier European arrivals, these immigrants often have a stronger indigenous genetic component, further reinforcing Argentina's Amerindian ancestry. At the same time, Argentina has become home to a rapidly growing Chinese community. Chinese immigrants, particularly those arriving since the 1990s, have established thriving businesses, from supermarkets to restaurants, weaving themselves into the country's economic fabric. Meanwhile, Korean and Japanese communities, though smaller, have maintained a distinct presence, adding yet another layer to Argentina's already complex genetic heritage. Perhaps one of the most unexpected immigration trends is the arrival of West African migrants, particularly from Senegal. Fleeing economic hardship, many Senegalese immigrants have made Argentina their new home, working as street vendors and entrepreneurs. Their presence, though still relatively small, marks a significant shift in the country's demographics, as new African genetic contributions enter the national gene pool after more than a century of near absence. As Argentina moves further into the 21st century, its genetic identity continues to evolve. The country that once prided itself on its European roots is now embracing a far more diverse reality, one that is reflected not just in culture, but deep within the DNA of its people. The future of Argentina's genetic identity is still being written, shaped by the people who continue to arrive, settle, and contribute to its ever-changing story.